Lord Byron, mad, bad and dangerous to know, notorious romantic hero and rock star poet, a genius obsessed by image, sexually irresistible to both men and women. His scandals shocked the nation. Byron was a 19th century superstar, fated to live fast and die young. On the 14th of May 1824, a month after Lord Byron's death, his closest friends gathered to read through his personal memoirs. After days of intense discussion, they reached a unanimous decision. Byron's memoirs could not be published and should go with him to the grave.
I think the reason why Byron has become such a kind of mythic figure is the fact that his memoirs were burned, and it was said they would damn Lord B to everlasting infamy if published. So it's, incredibly intriguing what could be in them, but it's meant that a whole legend can spring up around Byron because we don't have these kind of solid facts.
Byron is complex because he has his foot in most possible camps. He is male, strongly male, lives in a world of male friendships. Part of his personality is female, he's bisexual. He is a skeptic, he is religious, he believes passionately against war, dies as a soldier. He's extremely English but was born a Scot and makes himself into a European. You can keep going indefinitely in that kind of way.
In the early 19th century, Byron had gained international celebrity and notoriety through his romantic poetry.
Byron's a sort of celebrity in our modern sense of the word. He's a bit like a pop star. He's a bit like a famous actor.
And I think in many ways Byron was the original on-screen rebel. He's the grandfather of figures like James Dean in the 50s and rock and roll stars like Jim Morrison, who are tortured poets who live fast and die young. The way that women wrote about reading Byron was extremely sexualised in many ways. The famous courtesan Harriet Wilson wrote that she took Don Juan to bed with her and that it kept her up all night. And this kind of idea that it was like a lover that she slept with.
She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes.
Byron, probably more than any other figure in history or literature, was irresistible to all sexes. He was irresistible to women, to men, to friendship. I mean, he was a marvelous friend. He was a magnetic personality, a character of such charm and allure as to cast a spell, that there was a magical quality.
Byron's magnetic allure led him through a string of amorous liaisons, and he gained notoriety as a legendary sexual predator. His irresistible charms meant that no one was safe from his clutches.
Women were warned about looking him directly in the eye because they might be somehow mesmerised by him. Women would faint when he came into the room, famously. And certainly there was a lot of anxiety in the Christian and conservative press at the time that Byron would corrupt the young women of Britain.
Byron's poetry and behaviour were only part of his fascination.
His face was quite striking, and it was described as being like an alabaster vase lit up from within, which is glorious.
But Byron's beauty was flawed. He had been born with a club foot, which made him incredibly self-conscious, and he was obsessed with how he was portrayed.
He would make artists change certain things about him. He always showed his neck and had quite sort of low, open-collared shirts. Very pale skin, dark hair, red lips, big, full, kind of curled lips. He clearly saw that his portrait was going to be an important reference for his readers and act kind of like a pin-up does today.
Byron was a sexual magnet, but beneath the glamorous exterior lurked a more complex character.
When Byron was writing, the idea of the poet was very different from the idea of the poet we have today. The poet in Byron's day was perceived as a kind of hero. In those days, poets really thought they could change society. We don't tend to think of poetry as having a huge social effect.
The view of poetry inherited, and which he was passionately attached to, was that poetry had something to do with moral life, and that you brought into some kind of relationship the passions, beauty, and something like goodness, how to live well. You don't associate that with Byron, but please do. Byron believed that.
People tend to think about Byron as a haughty figure. In fact, he's a man who cared passionately about suffering. He's a great champion of liberty, and he's perceived by many of his readers as this great radical figure.
He was a heroic figure, mainly because he was a campaigner for the underdog, and he always supported the underdog.
Whilst heroic and romantic, there was also a mad, bad and dangerous side to Byron. His exploits left behind scores of jilted lovers and 2 children, one of whom he abandoned as a baby and another of whom he sent away to a lonely death at the age of 4. His poetry and lifestyle were to send Byron on a roller coaster ride of sex, drink and debauchery. By the age of 20, Lord Byron was a celebrity and heartthrob, but his humble beginnings told a very different story.
Byron was born above a perfumer's shop in 1788, and his mother was abandoned at the time he was born because his father, who was known as Mad Jack Byron, had been disowned by his wastrel family. He had married purely for her inheritance. He made off with most of that and managed to get into debt for more, and thus had to go into exile.
Byron's ancestors on both sides were pretty colourful. His grandfather was an admiral known as Admiral Foulweather Jack Byron, and indeed he was shipwrecked many times and wrote an interesting narrative about his shipwreck, which includes his having to eat the paws of his pet spaniel, which had actually been buried for several weeks. Byron's mother's family were Scottish lairds coming from Aberdeenshire. They were very wild, extremely wild.
The Gordons of Guyte were an ancient Scottish clan, but where there was such an extraordinarily terrifying strain of madness that both his grandfather and a great-grandfather had committed suicide, as well as one of his mother's sisters.
His mother was vulgar, but came from an aristocratic family, the Gordons, the lower branch, but she always said it was the high branch, and she drove a kind of snobbery and intense pride of ancestry into Byron.
Although Byron's mother came from a privileged background, she and her son enjoyed none of the rich trappings associated with the aristocracy. Mad Jack had died in exile, and mother and son had moved to Aberdeen in near poverty.
He lived with his mother above another shop in Aberdeen, very deprived circumstances, barely able to afford the day school that he went to with much better off boys. The life of a very, we would say, lower middle class little boy with a single mother.
Their future looked bleak, but in 1798, their circumstances changed overnight when Byron's uncle on his father's side, the 5th Lord Byron, died and left him with lands and titles beyond his wildest dreams.
Byron was suddenly catapulted into being Lord Byron. When he first was taken by his mother to see Newstead, this great crumbling Gothic pile, he was overwhelmed and he wanted passionately to live in it. They couldn't live in it because it was falling in ruins, but this became one of the great ambitions of his life.
The influence of Newstead on Byron really can't be underestimated. You can imagine you're an 8-year-old boy and then being told you've inherited this extraordinary abbey with its great chapel and beautiful grounds, wonderful lakes, and even though crumbling, it's a kind of mirage. You see it rising up out of rather flat ground unexpectedly in this lovely soft local granite near Nottingham.
On the one hand, it's terrible. You're not moving into an aristocratic lifestyle with plenty of money behind it. On the other hand, it's fantastic. You're moving into this mysterious Gothic past, which moves him instantly, fixes his imagination.
Byron's life was transformed. He grew into a young gentleman, and although he did not live at Newstead full-time, it became the perfect backdrop for a hedonistic young lord.
It was the setting for a lot of extremely rowdy parties in which the local girls were brought in. There was a great deal of drinking, and he had got the skull of a monk, which was his own particular drinking vessel. But Newstead was a marvellous background for this kind of Gothic festival in which they would dress up. Byron always fancied himself wearing monk's costume, partly because it kind of went rather well with the pallor of his face, I think, and partly because it was a kind of marvellous act of blasphemy.
It's the classic romantic abode in the sense that it's quite Gothic, and you can always picture the young Byron sort of brooding over various lost loves in this lovely Gothic backdrop.